There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching your child ask questions about the parent they never knew. For 22 years, Ulf the Giant has carried the weight of his wife's death alone, protecting his daughter Astrid from a truth that could shatter their world. When Astrid looks into the fire and whispers those words about her mother, she doesn't know she's opening a door to secrets that have been buried in ice and blood. Her mother wasn't just a village woman who died young, she was the daughter of Ulf's greatest enemy, and their forbidden love started a war that still echoes through the fjords today. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, rolling across the dark waters in ghostly waves. Astrid pulled her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the rocky path toward the village, her mother's silver pendant catching the first pale rays of sunlight that pierced through the heavy grey clouds. The pendant had been her constant companion since childhood, a delicate piece of Norse craftsmanship that bore intricate knotwork she'd never quite understood, symbols that seemed to dance and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Behind her, the longhouse where she'd spent her entire life stood like a sentinel against the mountainside, its timber walls weathered by countless storms but still strong, still protective. Much like her father, she often thought, Ulf Ironson, known throughout the northern reaches as the Giant of the Fjords, was a man who commanded respect through quiet strength rather than boastful words. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and hands that could crack stone, he was every inch the Viking warrior of old stories. Yet Astrid had only ever known him as a gentle father who braided her hair with surprising delicacy and told her bedtime stories about brave shield maidens and wise queens. The village of Ironwood lay nestled in the crook of the fjord, like a sleeping child in its mother's arms. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying the scent of burning pine and the promise of warm hearths. The wooden houses, built in the old style with carved dragon heads and rune-etched doorframes, clustered around the central longhouse where the village gathered for feasts and councils. This morning, as on most mornings, the settlement hummed with quiet activity, fishermen preparing their nets, women tending gardens that somehow thrived in this harsh northern soil, children playing games that had been passed down through generations. Astrid's destination was the healing house, a smaller structure set apart from the others, where she practiced the arts her father had taught her. Ulf had been surprisingly knowledgeable about herbs and healing for a man of his size and reputation. He'd shown her which plants could ease pain, which could fight infection, and which should never be touched by human hands. "Your mother was gifted in these ways," he would say when she asked where he'd learned such things. "She would have wanted you to carry on her work, but her mother was a mystery, wrapped in silence. Freya, Ulf called her, and his voice would grow soft whenever he spoke the name. She had died when Astrid was born, he'd told her, taken by complications that even the best healers couldn't prevent. Beyond that, details were scarce. No family had come to mourn her. No friends visited to share memories. It was as if Freya had materialized from the mists, loved Ulf fiercely for a brief time, and then vanished back into legend. "Good morning, healer." The voice belonged to Eric Bloodaxe, though the young warrior's axe had never tasted blood in battle. At 24, he was one of the finest fighters in the village, with auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight and eyes the color of storm clouds. He'd been courting Astrid with the patience of a hunter, bringing her small gifts, a rare flower from the high meadows, a piece of amber with an insect trapped inside, a wooden comb he'd carved himself during the long winter evenings. "Good morning, Eric." She smiled at him, genuinely pleased to see his familiar face. "What brings you to the healing house so early? Surely you haven't found a way to injure yourself before breakfast?" He laughed, a rich sound that echoed off the surrounding cliffs. "No injuries today, thanks to the gods. I came to see if you might join me for the morning meal. Magnus has called a gathering, and I thought you might want to hear what news he brings." Magnus the Wise was the village elder, a man whose beard had turned white when Astrid was still a child, but whose mind remained sharp as a well-honed blade. He served as counselor, keeper of traditions, and linked to the outside world through his network of traders and travelers. If Magnus was calling a gathering, it meant news from beyond their peaceful fjord, and in these unsettled times, news was rarely good. They walked together toward the central longhouse, their footsteps crunching on the frost-covered ground. The building was already filling with villagers, their voices creating a low murmur of anticipation. Ulf stood near the great hearth, his massive frame making even the large room seem smaller. His weathered face was thoughtful as he spoke quietly with Magnus, their grey heads bent together like conspirators. "Father," Astrid called as she approached, and Ulf's face brightened with the smile he reserved only for her. 22 years of loving this man, and she still felt that warm rush of belonging whenever he looked at her that way. She was his whole world, and he was hers, a bond forged in the shared understanding that they were all each other had. "Little Star," he said, using the pet name from her childhood. "Magnus brings word from the eastern settlements. Troubling news, I'm afraid." Magnus stepped forward, his walking stick tapping against the stone floor. Despite his age, his voice still carried the authority of one accustomed to being heard. "Raiders have been moving through the coastal villages, not the usual opportunists looking for easy plunder, but organized bands asking questions, seeking information about specific people, specific bloodlines." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air ran down Astrid's spine. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest old debts coming due," Magnus replied, his pale eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Wars that some thought finished 20 years ago. Alliances that were never properly buried with the dead." Ulf's hand settled on Astrid's shoulder, large and protective. "Whatever storms are coming, they'll break against our walls before they reach you," he said firmly. "This village has weathered worse than raiders and lived to tell the tale." But as the gathering dispersed and the villagers returned to their daily tasks, Astrid couldn't shake the feeling that Magnus had been looking directly at her when he spoke of old debts and unfinished wars. She touched her mother's pendant unconsciously, the silver warm against her palm, and wondered what secrets might be hidden in its ancient symbols. That evening, as was their custom, she and Ulf sat by their private hearth, sharing the day's final meal. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind outside howled like something wild and lonely. Ulf was quieter than usual, his massive hands turning a wooden cup over and over as if it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. "Father," Astrid said softly, "tell me about her, about my mother." He looked up, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes, pain, perhaps, or fear. "What would you know, little star?" "Everything. Where she came from, how you met, what she was like." Astrid leaned forward, firelight reflecting in her earnest gaze. "Sometimes I feel as if she's just beyond my reach, like a song I can almost remember but not quite sing." Ulf was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She was beautiful, Astrid. Beautiful and fierce and kind. She could heal wounds with her touch and see things others couldn't see. The plants and animals trusted her, and children would stop crying when she sang to them." "Where did she come from?" "The north," he said vaguely. "A settlement that was destroyed in a clan war. She was one of the few survivors who made it this far south." "Do I look like her?" Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "You have her eyes," he said carefully, "and her way of tilting your head when you're thinking. But you're your own person, Astrid. Never forget that." Later, as she prepared for sleep, Astrid caught sight of herself in the polished bronze mirror that had been her mother's. Her reflection stared back, angular cheekbones, eyes the color of winter sky, hair that shifted between gold and silver depending on the light. She tried to imagine her mother's face, to see some echo of Freya in her own features, but the woman remained a mystery. Outside her window, the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, a reminder that in this northern land, even darkness could be beautiful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and perhaps, if the gods were kind, new answers. But tonight, she was content to be exactly where she was, safe in her father's house, protected by his love, and blessed with a life that, while simple, was rich in all the ways that mattered. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last peaceful night of her life, or that the pendant around her neck bore the symbol of a clan that had been searching for her since the day she was born. The merchant arrived 3 days later like a harbinger of storms, his weathered cart groaning under the weight of goods from distant lands. Bjorn, the trader, was a familiar figure in Ironwood, a man who dealt in necessities and luxuries alike, iron tools from the southern forges, amber from the Baltic shores, and spices that carried the scent of worlds beyond the fjords. But this time, something was different in his manner, a tension that set the village dogs to barking and made the horses restless in their stalls. Astrid was grinding willow bark for pain remedy when Eric burst through the door of the healing house, his face flushed with excitement and concern. "You need to come quickly," he said, barely pausing to catch his breath. "The merchant, he's asking questions about you." "About me?" Astrid set down her mortar and pestle, brushing the bitter powder from her hands. "What sort of questions?" "He saw you at the well this morning and went pale as fresh snow. Started asking Magnus if he knew your lineage, where your people came from." Eric's storm-grey eyes were troubled. "Astrid, he called you by a name that wasn't yours." They hurried toward the market square where Bjorn had set up his cart. A crowd had gathered, as always happened when a trader brought news from the outside world. But the usual, cheerful atmosphere was strained. Ulf stood at the edge of the group, his massive frame tense with barely controlled emotion. His eyes tracked every movement the merchant made, like a wolf watching a potential threat. "There," Eric whispered, pointing toward the cart. "Look at his banner." Hanging from the merchant's cart was a piece of cloth that made Astrid's breath catch in her throat. It was torn and bloodied, clearly old, but she could still make out the symbol woven into its fabric, a black raven with wings spread wide, clutching a sword in its talons. Something about that image sent a chill through her bones, a recognition she couldn't explain. Bjorn looked up as they approached, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile or a grimace. He was a man past 50, with iron-grey hair braided with trading beads and eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. When his gaze fell on Astrid, he went perfectly still. "By Thor's hammer," he breathed, his voice barely audible above the market noise. "It cannot be." "What cannot be?" Astrid stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You asked about my lineage. Why?" The merchant's eyes darted to Ulf, then back to her face. 23 years ago, I knew a woman who looked exactly as you do now. Same eyes, same bearing, same way of holding her head when she was thinking." He reached into his cart with trembling hands and pulled out the torn banner. "She carried this into battle the last time I saw her alive." Ulf moved like lightning for such a large man, his hand closing over the merchant's wrist before Bjorn could fully display the banner. "Careful what old ghosts you wake, trader," he rumbled, his voice carrying a warning that made several villagers step back. But Astrid had seen enough of the symbol to feel the world shift beneath her feet. "That's the same mark that's on my mother's pendant," she said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. She pulled the silver chain from beneath her tunic, holding the pendant up to the light. The intricate knotwork she'd admired all her life suddenly made terrible sense. It wasn't just decoration, but a clan symbol worked in precious metal. Bjorn's face went even paler. "You're wearing the seal of the Blackrock clan," he whispered. "The Raven's daughter." His eyes fixed on Ulf, with something approaching awe. "You kept her. After all these years, you kept her safe." "I don't know what you're talking about," Ulf said. but his voice lacked conviction. The massive warrior who had faced down raiders and wolves looked suddenly old and tired. The Blackrock clan was destroyed, Magnus interjected, his walking stick tapping nervously against the ground. Everyone knows that. The war ended 20 years ago with no survivors from the bloodline. Bjorn shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off Astrid. Not everyone. The daughter of Freya Blackrock survived, hidden away by the man who loved her more than his own life. He looked at Ulf with something like respect. Though I never thought to find her here, raised as a simple village healer. The market square had gone dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the implications of the merchant's words settled over the gathered villagers. Astrid felt as if she were drowning, the familiar world of her childhood crumbling around her like poorly mortared stone. "My mother's name was Freya," she said numbly. "But she couldn't have been Freya Blackrock, daughter of Thormund the Raven King, heir to the Northern clan's oldest bloodline." Bjorn continued relentlessly. "She fell in love with her family's greatest enemy and paid for it with her life. But not before she gave birth to a daughter who would either unite the clans or destroy them forever." Ulf's control finally snapped. He grabbed Bjorn by the front of his tunic and lifted the smaller man off his feet. "Enough," he snarled. "You've said enough." But the damage was done. Astrid could see it in the faces around her: fear, speculation, calculation. The simple village girl they'd known all her life was suddenly something else entirely, a living reminder of wars they'd thought forgotten and bloodlines they'd assumed extinct. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Father, is what he says true?" Ulf set the merchant down and turned to face his daughter. For a moment, the giant of the fjords looked lost, caught between the truth he'd hidden and the love that had driven him to hide it. "Astrid, is it true?" she repeated, stronger this time. The silence stretched between them like a blade. Then, slowly, Ulf nodded. "Yes," he said, the word falling like a stone into still water. "It's true." The market square erupted in whispers and worried murmurs. Some villagers began backing away, as if proximity to Astrid might bring down some ancient curse upon their heads. Others pressed closer, hungry for details about the scandal that had just landed in their quiet settlement. Magnus stepped forward, his face grave. "If this is true, then we face a choice that will determine the fate of everyone in this village. The Blackrock clan has enemies, old and powerful enemies who have been searching for any remnant of that bloodline for 20 years. "What enemies?" Eric demanded, moving protectively closer to Astrid. The merchant's laugh was bitter. "Every clan north of the Whale Road, boy. The Blackrocks didn't just rule through strength, they ruled through alliance and marriage, binding the northern territories together under one banner. When they fell, a dozen petty kings rose to claim pieces of their territory. If word spreads that the heir lives, they'll come," Magnus finished grimly. "All of them. Some to claim her as a prize, others to ensure she never threatens their newfound power." Astrid looked around at the faces surrounding her, some familiar, some suddenly strange. These people had been her family, her world, her entire understanding of herself. Now they looked at her as if she were a dangerous animal that might bite at any moment. "I need time to think," she said, backing away from the crowd. I need to understand what this means." She turned and ran, her mother's pendant bouncing against her chest with every step. Behind her, she could hear Ulf calling her name, but she didn't stop until she reached the healing house and barred the door behind her. Only then did she allow herself to collapse onto a wooden stool, her hands shaking as the full weight of revelation crashed over her. She wasn't Astrid the healer anymore. She was Astrid Blackrock, heir to a legacy of blood and war, daughter of enemies and target of forces she couldn't even imagine. And somewhere out there, people who wanted her dead or captured were already beginning to stir, drawn by the scent of royal blood like wolves to fresh prey. The simple life she'd known was over. What came next would require strength she wasn't sure she possessed, and choices that would echo through the northern lands for generations to come. The healing house felt like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. Astrid sat in the growing darkness, surrounded by the familiar scents of dried herbs and healing oils, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every sound outside made her wonder if enemies were already approaching. The pendant around her neck, her mother's pendant, the seal of the Blackrock clan, felt heavier than iron chains. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Astrid. Ulf's voice was gentle, careful, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. "May I come in?" She didn't answer immediately, but she didn't bar the door either. After a moment, the massive warrior pushed inside, moving with surprising delicacy among the shelves of healing supplies. In the dim light filtering through the small windows, he looked older than she'd ever seen him, the weight of 22 years of deception finally showing in the lines around his eyes. "You lied to me," she said without looking at him. "My entire life, you lied to me." Ulf lowered himself onto a stool that creaked under his weight. "I protected you," he corrected quietly. "There's a difference, is there?" Astrid finally turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes made him flinch. "You let me believe I was nobody special, just a village healer with a dead mother and no family beyond you. Now I find out I'm the heir to a royal bloodline that half the North wants to claim or kill. If you had known the truth, would you have been happier?" Ulf asked. "Would knowing that your mother died because of who she was, that enemies have been hunting for you since the day you were born, have made your childhood better?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Astrid wanted to be angry, to rage at him for the deception, but underneath her fury was a deeper understanding. She had been happy, hadn't she? Safe and loved and free to grow into herself without the weight of royal expectations or the constant fear of assassination. "Tell me about her," she said finally. "Not the story you've been telling me all these years. The truth." Ulf was quiet for a long moment, his massive hands clasped before him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory and old grief. "Freya was the most remarkable woman I ever knew. Beautiful, yes, but that was the least of her gifts. She could heal with her touch, not just the body, but the spirit. Plants would bloom when she walked past them, animals would calm at her voice, and children who had been crying would smile when she looked at them." "Where did you meet her?" "On a battlefield." The admission came hard, pulled from him like a sword from a stone. "I was fighting for the Ironwood Confederation, trying to push back Blackrock expansion into our territory. She was tending the wounded on both sides, refusing to let anyone die if she could prevent it." Astrid leaned forward, drawn despite herself into the story she'd waited her whole life to hear. "What happened? I was wounded badly. An axe to the ribs that should have killed me. I woke up 3 days later in a Blackrock healing tent with Freya sitting beside my bed, keeping watch." Ulf's eyes grew distant, lost in memories that were clearly both precious and painful. "She said she couldn't let me die, because the world needed more men willing to protect the innocent, even if they were on the wrong side. And you fell in love with her, like a stone falls into deep water, completely, and without any chance of return." A small smile touched Ulf's weathered face. "She was supposed to be my enemy, the daughter of the man I'd sworn to fight. Instead, she became the center of my world. But someone found out." The smile vanished. "Her brother did. Thormund discovered that she was meeting with me in secret, that we'd spoken wedding vows before the old gods without clan approval. He demanded she choose her family or her heart. She chose you. She chose love," Ulf corrected, "and it cost her everything. Her family disowned her, branded her a traitor. My own people barely tolerated the marriage, and only because I was too valuable a warrior to lose over a woman's choice." Astrid absorbed this, trying to reconcile the romantic tragedy with her own existence. "But she was pregnant with me. The one bright spot in a very dark time. When she told me you were coming, it was the happiest I'd ever seen her." She said you would be the bridge between our peoples, the one who could end the cycles of war and bring peace to the northern clans. Instead, she died. Ulf's face went hard. She was murdered while giving birth to you, when she was most vulnerable. Assassins came in the night, sent by those who couldn't bear the thought of a child who carried both bloodlines living to adulthood. The words hit Astrid like physical blows. You fought them? I killed them all, Ulf said simply. But I was too late to save her. She lived just long enough to hold you, to name you Astrid, Divine Star, and to make me promise I would keep you safe, no matter the cost. Astrid's hand moved unconsciously to her pendant, fingers tracing the intricate raven design. This was hers, her mother's before her, and her grandmother's before that. The women of the Blackrock line have worn it for generations. Ulf reached into his tunic and pulled out something that made Astrid's breath catch, a collection of small stones, each one carved with runes and polished smooth by countless hands. These were hers too. Healing stones, blessed by the old gods and passed down through the royal line. The moment Astrid touched the stones, the world exploded into sensation. Images flashed through her mind, her mother as a young woman, laughing as she gathered herbs in a mountain meadow, Freya tending wounded warriors with gentle hands, her mother's face twisted in pain and determination as she brought Astrid into the world, while battle raged outside. But there was more. The stones carried memories that weren't her mother's alone, generations of Blackrock women who had served as healers and wise women who had walked the line between the physical and spiritual worlds. Power flowed through the stones like water through a riverbed, ancient and patient and waiting for the right hands to channel it. I can see them, Astrid whispered, her voice filled with wonder and fear. All of them, the women who came before. Ulf nodded grimly. The gift runs in your blood. Your mother could commune with spirits, see glimpses of the future, heal wounds that should have been fatal. The stones amplify that power, but they also make it harder to hide what you are. Is that why you never gave them to me before? I hoped you would never need them. I hoped I could keep you safe and ordinary, and free from the burdens that come with such gifts. He looked at her with infinite sadness. But the time for hiding is over, isn't it? Before Astrid could answer, Eric's voice came from outside, urgent and worried. Ulf, Astrid, you need to see this. They emerged from the healing house to find Eric pointing toward the fjord. In the distance, barely visible in the growing twilight, dark shapes moved across the water. Ships, at least 3 of them, flying banners that snapped in the wind like battle standards. How long until they reach us? Ulf asked, his voice already shifting into the tone of a military commander. Dawn, maybe sooner if the wind holds. Eric's hand was already on his sword hilt. Magnus says they're flying the Blood Axe clan colors. Astrid felt the healing stones grow warm in her palm, and suddenly she knew with terrible certainty that her childhood was truly over. The enemies her father had protected her from for 22 years had finally found her, and the simple village of Ironwood was about to become a battlefield once again. The village transformed overnight from a peaceful settlement into a fortress preparing for siege. Ulf moved through Ironwood like a general preparing for war, his years of military experience taking over as he organized defenses and assigned positions. But beneath his confident exterior, Astrid could see the weight of terrible choices pressing down on him, the knowledge that his decision to harbor a Blackrock heir had brought danger to everyone he'd sworn to protect. Magnus gathered the village council in the great hall as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The old advisor seemed to have aged years in the space of hours, his walking stick trembling slightly as he leaned on it for support. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravity of pronouncing judgment. The approaching ships carry more than just Blood Axe warriors, he announced to the assembled villagers. My sources tell me they've allied with the Stoneheart clan and the Iron Wolves, 3 major houses, united in purpose for the first time in a generation. What do they want? Asked Ingrid the baker, her flour-dusted hands wringing her apron nervously. Magnus's pale eyes found Astrid in the crowd. They want to claim what they believe is rightfully theirs. A Blackrock heir represents legitimacy, a way to unite the Northern Territories under a single banner once again. But they also fear what she might become if left to her own devices. And what might that be? Eric stepped closer to Astrid, his hand resting protectively on his sword hilt. A rallying point for all those who remember the old ways, Magnus replied. The Blackrock clan didn't rule through conquest alone, they ruled through justice, through healing, through the kind of leadership that made people want to follow rather than forcing them to obey. If word spreads that the heir lives and has inherited her mother's gifts, then every farmer who's been ground under a tyrant's heel, every merchant who's been robbed by corrupt jarls, every mother who's lost sons to pointless wars will look to her for salvation, Ulf finished grimly. And the current rulers know it. Astrid felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Around the hall, faces turned toward her, with expressions ranging from hope to fear to calculation. These people had known her all her life as a simple healer, but now they were seeing her as something else, entirely a symbol, a weapon, a danger to everything they held dear. "There's another choice," she said quietly, and the hall fell silent. "I could go with them. If what they want is me, maybe." "No." Ulf's voice cut through her words like an axe through wood. "I didn't spend 22 years keeping you safe just to hand you over to ambitious warriors who see you as nothing more than a path to power. But if staying here means people die in the wars regardless," Magnus interrupted, his tone unusually sharp. "The question is whether they die for something worthwhile or just to delay the inevitable. If you surrender now, you'll be used as a pawn in someone else's game. But if you fight, if you claim your heritage and stand for the principles your mother died defending, then perhaps their sacrifice will mean something." Eric moved to stand beside her, his young face set with determination. "Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. I swore an oath to protect this village and everyone in it. That includes you, royal blood or not." His loyalty warmed her, but Astrid could see the fear in his eyes. Eric was brave and skilled, but he was also young and had never faced anything like the force approaching their shores. None of them had. The Bloodaxe clan alone could field twice as many warriors as Ironwood could muster, and they were coming with allies. That night, as the village prepared for battle, Astrid retreated to her father's longhouse and made a decision that would have horrified Ulf if he'd known about it. Hidden beneath the floorboards, where she'd occasionally heard strange creaking sounds over the years, she found what she was looking for, her mother's personal possessions, carefully preserved and sealed away from prying eyes. The leather-bound journal was written in a script that seemed to shift and flow before her eyes, runes that arranged themselves into meaning as she focused on them. Freya's voice seemed to whisper from the pages, telling the story of a young woman torn between duty and love, between the weight of tradition and the promise of something new. Asterisk, "My beloved daughter." Asterisk, one entry read. Asterisk, "If you are reading this, then the worst has come to pass, and I am no longer with you to guide your steps. Know that you were conceived in love and born into hope, that every choice I made was to give you a better world than the one I inherited." Asterisk, Astrid read on, her heart breaking and swelling by turns as her mother's personality emerged from the ancient pages. Freya had been funny and fierce, compassionate and determined, willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to break the cycles of violence that had plagued the northern clans for generations. Asterisk, "The pendant you wear carries more than just our family's symbol." Asterisk, another passage revealed. Asterisk, "It was blessed by the vulva of the sacred grove, imbued with protection spells that will shield you from those who would do you harm. But remember, daughter, true protection comes not from magic alone, but from the courage to stand for what is right, even when the cost is dear." Asterisk, near the journal's end, Astrid found something that made her blood run cold, detailed descriptions of the political situation that had led to Freya's death, including names and alliances that painted a clear picture of who had wanted the Blackrock line eliminated. Some of those names belonged to the very clans now approaching Ironwood's shores. But most shocking of all was the final entry, written in a different hand, her father's careful script, documenting the night of her birth and her mother's death. The attackers hadn't been random assassins sent by faceless enemies. They had been led by someone Freya trusted, someone close enough to know exactly when and where she would be most vulnerable. Asterisk Magnus was among them. Asterisk Ulf had written in obvious anguish. Asterisk, I saw his face in the torchlight as they fled. The man I trusted as advisor and friend led killers to my wife's bedside. But I cannot prove it, and Astrid will need allies in the years to come. I pray the gods forgive me for this choice. Asterisk. The journal slipped from Astrid's nerveless fingers as the implications crashed over her. Magnus the Wise, the village elder who had guided her since childhood, who even now was helping to organize their defenses, he was the one who had murdered her mother, and he was planning to do something similar to her. Outside, she could hear the sounds of preparation continuing, weapons being sharpened, defenses being strengthened, strategies being discussed. But all of it was meaningless if the greatest threat came from within their own walls. Astrid clutched her mother's healing stones, feeling their warmth pulse against her palm like a heartbeat, and tried to decide who she could trust with this terrible knowledge. The ships would reach shore by dawn, bringing with them warriors who saw her as either a prize to be won or a threat to be eliminated. But the real danger wore a familiar face and spoke with a trusted voice, waiting for the perfect moment to complete a murder that had begun 22 years ago in a birthing chamber stained with blood and betrayal. Dawn broke grey and cold over the fjord, painting the approaching longships in shades of iron and blood. Astrid stood on the village's highest watchtower, her mother's healing stones warm in one hand and the terrible knowledge of Magnus's betrayal burning in her chest like swallowed fire. Below her, Ironwood's defenders took their positions behind hastily constructed barricades, their faces grim with the understanding that they were vastly outnumbered. The lead ship bore a banner she recognized from her mother's journal, the crossed axes of the Blood Axe clan, but flying alongside it were the stone hammer of the Stonehearts and the wolf's head of the Iron Wolves. 3 major houses united against one small village, all for the sake of a young woman who had only learned her true name yesterday. They'll demand parley first, Ulf said, climbing up beside her with the careful movements of a man conserving strength for the battle ahead. It's the old way, even among enemies. And what will they offer? Your life in exchange for your freedom. Marriage to one of their sons, probably, with the understanding that any children you bear will strengthen their claim to Blackrock lands. His weathered face was hard as granite. They'll make it sound reasonable, even generous. Astrid fingered the scroll she'd found hidden in her mother's journal, the prophecy written in Freya's own hand, speaking of a daughter who would either unite the clans or destroy them. The weight of destiny felt heavier than armor, more constraining than chains. Father, she said carefully, what if Magnus isn't entirely on our side? Ulf's hand stilled on his axe handle. What do you mean? She wanted to tell him everything about the journal, about the revelation of Magnus's role in her mother's death, about the growing certainty that they were being betrayed from within. But something held her back, a caution that might have come from her mother's blood or simply from 22 years of learning to read the currents of adult emotion. Just a feeling, she said instead. Something about the way he looked at me yesterday, when the merchant revealed who I was, like he was calculating something. Before Ulf could respond, a horn sounded from the fjord, the long, mournful note that meant the enemy was requesting formal parley. The ships had anchored just beyond arrow range, and a single small boat was being lowered into the dark water. "Stay here," Ulf commanded, but Astrid was already shaking her head. "If they want to talk to the Blackrock heir, then they need to talk to me. I won't hide behind others while my presence puts them in danger." The parley took place on the beach, with both sides maintaining careful distance and watchful weapons. The blood axe representative was a man-mountain nearly as large as Ulf himself, with scars that told of a lifetime of warfare and eyes like chips of winter ice. He introduced himself as Ragnar Bloodaxe, son of the clan chief and heir to their considerable power. "Lady Astrid," he said with a bow that managed to be both respectful and mocking. "Or should I say, Lady Astrid Blackrock, rightful heir to the Northern Throne." "I'm not sure there is a Northern Throne anymore," Astrid replied carefully. "From what I understand, it was destroyed along with most of my family 23 years ago." Ragnar's smile was sharp as a blade. "Thrones can be rebuilt, bloodlines restored, old alliances renewed. The question is whether you're wise enough to see the opportunities being offered to you." Magnus stepped forward, his walking stick tapping against the rocky beach. "Speak plainly, Ragnar. What does your alliance propose?" "Marriage," Ragnar said bluntly. "Lady Astrid weds into one of our houses. My own would be honored to receive her, and in return, she lives to see her bloodline continue and her people prosper under our protection." "And if she refuses?" Eric asked, his hand never leaving his sword hilt. "Then we take what we came for by force, and everyone dies except the lady herself. She'll still marry into our alliance, but as a captive rather than a willing bride." Ragnar's tone remained conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than threatening massacre. Astrid felt the healing stones pulse against her palm, and suddenly she could see more than just the beach and the assembled warriors. Overlaying the present moment, like a translucent painting, she saw flashes of possible futures, ironwood burning while she was dragged away in chains, herself standing over Ragnar's corpse while allied clans knelt in submission, the fjord running red with blood as supernatural forces tore reality apart. "I need time to consider," she said, pushing down the visions that threatened to overwhelm her senses. "Time is a luxury you don't possess," Ragnar replied. "My allies grow impatient, and there are others coming who won't be as generous with their terms." "Others?" Magnus answered before Ragnar could speak. "The Raven's children have been seen moving south from the wasteland. If they reach us before this matter is settled." "The Raven's children were wiped out with the rest of the Blackrock loyalists," Ulf interrupted sharply. Ragnar's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Tell that to the dozen villages they've burned in the past month, all while searching for something they call the lost daughter. They're coming, Giant, and when they arrive, your little settlement will be caught between hammer and anvil." The parley ended with no resolution, both sides withdrawing to consider their options. But as they walked back toward the village, Astrid noticed Magnus lingering near the beach, engaged in what appeared to be private conversation with one of Ragnar's men. The exchange was brief, but she caught the glint of silver changing hands before. The enemy warrior returned to his boat. That evening, as Ironwood prepared for what might be its final night of peace, Astrid made a decision that would have horrified her father. Using skills her mother's journal had taught her and power drawn from the ancient healing stones, she cast her consciousness outward like a net, searching for the approaching force Magnus had mentioned. What she found chilled her to the bone. The Raven's children were real, a surviving remnant of Blackrock loyalists who had spent 2 decades in the northern wastes, driven mad by grief and isolation. They were coming south with a fury that bordered on religious mania, burning everything in their path as they searched for their lost princess. But worse than their approach was their composition. These weren't just surviving warriors, they were led by someone whose presence in her mystical sight felt familiar, terrifyingly so. A woman whose power dwarfed Astrid's own nascent abilities, whose rage had been fermenting for 23 years, whose very existence meant that everything Astrid thought she knew about her family's fate was wrong. Her mother's sister lived. Aunt Sigrid, the Volva whose blessing had protected Astrid's pendant, had survived the massacre that claimed the rest of the Blackrock line. And she was coming to either save her niece or drag her back to a heritage steeped in blood and vengeance. The healing stones grew hot in Astrid's palm as the vision faded, leaving her gasping on the floor of her father's longhouse. Outside, she could hear Magnus's voice raised in discussion with the village council, no doubt offering his wisdom about their impossible situation. But Astrid knew now that his counsel came with a price, that every word from his lips was shaped by guilt and self-interest. Tomorrow would bring choices that would echo through the northern lands for generations. But tonight, she had to decide whether to trust the father who had lied to protect her, the village elder who had murdered her mother, or the approaching aunt whose love had been twisted into something unrecognizable by decades of isolation and rage. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on Astrid like stones in a burial cairn. She sat in the darkness of her father's longhouse, surrounded by the detritus of her shattered childhood, the healing supplies that had once defined her identity, the simple furnishings that had sheltered a life of peaceful deception, the hidden treasures that revealed a heritage steeped in blood and power. In her hands, she held the weapon that would change everything. Widowmaker had been hidden beneath Ulf's sleeping furs for 20 years, wrapped in oiled leather and bound with iron chains that bore runic inscriptions of warding and sorrow. The war axe was a thing of terrible beauty, its steel head etched with patterns that seemed to writhe in the firelight, its ash handle worn smooth by the grip of a man who had once been the most feared warrior in the northern reaches. Ulf found her there as the first pale light of dawn crept through the smoke hole, his massive frame filling the doorway like a monument to violence held in check. When he saw what she held, his face went grey as weathered stone. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said quietly. "When did you last hold it?" she asked, not looking up from the weapon's deadly edge. "The night your mother died. I used it to kill the men who murdered her, and I swore I would never lift it again unless—" He stopped, the words hanging between them like a blade. "Unless you had to protect me." Astrid finally met his eyes, seeing the weight of old oaths and older grief. "Father, I know about Magnus." Ulf went very still. "What do you know?" "I know he led the assassins to Mother's bedside. I know he's been planning this moment for 23 years, waiting for the right time to finish what he started." She set Widowmaker aside and pulled out her mother's journal, opening it to the page that had shattered her world. "I know you've been carrying this knowledge alone all these years, and I know why you couldn't act on it." Ulf sank onto a stool, suddenly looking every one of his 50-odd years. If I had killed him then, the village would have torn itself apart. He was respected, trusted, seen as wise and just. I was the outsider, the warrior who had brought trouble to their peaceful settlement. Without proof, you would have been exiled or executed, and I would have been left defenseless. Astrid moved to sit beside him, this man who had sacrificed so much to keep her safe. "But now we know he's still working against us. I saw him talking to Ragnar's men, taking silver for information. What information could he have that they don't already possess? The defenses we're planning, the number of warriors we can field, maybe even—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Maybe he knows about Aunt Sigrid." Ulf's head snapped up. "Sigrid is dead. She died with the rest of your mother's family." "No, father, she didn't." Astrid told him about her vision, about the approaching force of Blackrock loyalists, led by a Volva whose power dwarfed her own. "She's been gathering survivors for 20 years, building an army in the wasteland, and she's coming here." The implications settled over them like a funeral shroud. Ironwood was about to become the meeting point of three forces, the Blood Axe Alliance seeking to claim Astrid as a political prize, the Raven's children wanting to restore her to some twisted version of Blackrock glory, and a small village caught between them with no chance of survival. "There's more," Astrid continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The healing stones showed me something else. Magnus isn't just betraying our defenses to Ragnar, he's been sending word north, telling Aunt Sigrid where to find me. Why would he do that? If Sigrid is as powerful as you say, because he thinks he won and can control the outcome. He's been playing all sides, positioning himself to be the power behind whichever throne emerges from the chaos." Astrid's hand moved to her mother's pendant, feeling the ancient power pulsing within the silver. "But he made one mistake." He doesn't understand what I'm becoming. As if summoned by her words, Eric appeared in the doorway, his young face flushed with urgency. Ulf, Astrid, you need to come quickly. Magnus is calling another council meeting, and there are things you need to hear. They followed him to the great hall, where the village had gathered in the grey pre-dawn light. Magnus stood before the assembled crowd, his walking stick tapping rhythmically against the stone floor as he spoke of hard choices and necessary sacrifices. But Astrid was no longer listening to his words. Instead, she was watching the way he moved, the subtle positioning that kept him near the doors, the careful glances he cast toward the harbour where Ragnar's ships waited. The situation has changed, Magnus was saying. Word has reached us that additional forces are approaching from the north, remnants of the old Blackrock loyalists who refuse to accept that their time has passed. If they reach us before this matter is resolved, Ironwood will be destroyed in the crossfire. What do you propose? Asked Olaf the blacksmith, his leather apron still stained with soot from a night spent forging weapons. That we accept Ragnar's offer before worse alternatives present themselves. Lady Astrid marries into the Bloodaxe clan, ensuring her safety and our survival. And if I refuse? Astrid stepped forward, every eye in the hall turning toward her. What then, Magnus the Wise? Something flickered across the old man's face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Then you doom everyone in this village to death for the sake of your pride. Or maybe I choose a third option. Astrid's hand closed around her mother's healing stones, feeling their power flow through her like liquid fire. Maybe I stop running from who I am and start embracing it. The stones blazed with sudden light, casting shadows that danced like living things across the hall's wooden walls. Several villagers gasped and stepped back as Astrid's eyes began to glow with the same ethereal radiance, her mother's power finally awakening after 22 years of dormancy. "You want the Blackrock heir?" she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in everyone's bones. "Then you'll have her, but not as anyone's prize or pawn." Magnus's face went pale as the implications of her transformation became clear. For 20 years, he had been positioning himself to control or eliminate the last Blackrock heir. Now he was discovering that some powers couldn't be controlled, only unleashed. Outside, the morning wind carried the sound of ships approaching from the north, not Ragnar's alliance, but something older and angrier. The Raven's children had arrived, and with them came Astrid's aunt, the Volva whose love had been forged into a weapon by 2 decades of grief and rage. The pieces were finally in position for a confrontation that would reshape the northern lands. But as the light in Astrid's eyes grew brighter and the healing stones sang with power that predated human memory, it became clear that the outcome would be decided not by political maneuvering or military might, but by the choice of a young woman who was finally ready to claim her destiny. The moment of revelation came not with the clash of weapons or the roar of battle, but with the rustle of parchment in the growing dawn light. Eric burst through the doors of the great hall, his face pale with shock and betrayal, clutching a leather satchel that bore Magnus's personal seal. "I found this hidden in his quarters," Eric announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Letters, dozens of them, going back years." Magnus went rigid, his walking stick trembling in his grasp. For the first time since Astrid had known him, the village elder looked truly old, not wise with age, but brittle with the weight of long-hidden guilt. "What letters?" Ulf demanded, but Astrid was already moving toward Eric, her newfound power allowing her to sense the darkness that clung to the documents like a shroud. "Correspondence with every major clan north of the Whale Road," Eric said, spilling the contents of the satchel onto the council table. "Plans, payments, promises. Magnus, what have you done?" The assembled villagers pressed closer as Astrid began reading aloud from the topmost letter, her voice steady despite the growing horror of what she was discovering. "To Ragnar Bloodaxe, son of Harald, war chief of the Northern Alliance. The package you seek will be delivered as promised, but the price has increased. The girl's powers are manifesting earlier than anticipated. She picked up another scroll, this one bearing the raven seal of the Blackrock loyalists. To Sigrid the Vulva, last daughter of the sacred grove, your sister's child lives and thrives, but she knows nothing of her heritage. The time approaches when you must choose between vengeance and mercy, Magnus. Ulf's voice was deadly quiet. Explain. The old man's composure finally cracked, years of careful deception crumbling like a dam burst by spring floods. I did what was necessary, he said, his voice rising to match the accusations in every face around him. 23 years ago, this village was dying. Crops failed, young people left for better prospects, and we were forgotten by the world. Then Ulf arrives with his pregnant bride, bringing with her the attention of every power-hungry lord in the northern reaches. "So you murdered my mother," Astrid said, her words falling like stones into still water. "I saved this village." Magnus slammed his walking stick against the floor, the sound echoing through the hall like a judge's gavel. Freya Blackrock was a symbol of everything that kept these lands locked in cycles of violence. As long as she lived, as long as her bloodline continued, there would never be peace. Instead, you created 20 years of deception and manipulation, Eric said, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "How many people have died because of your schemes?" Magnus laughed, a bitter sound that held no warmth. "How many people have lived because of them? Do you think it was accident that Ironwood prospered these past decades? That raiders passed us by, that traders sought us out, that our children grew up safe from the wars that consumed our neighbors? You made deals," Astrid realized, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "All these years, you've been trading information, playing different factions against each other, keeping everyone focused on threats that never materialized, while the real prize stayed hidden. I kept you alive," Magnus said, his pale eyes fixed on her with something that might have been genuine regret. "Even after I realized what you were becoming, I protected you. Do you think Sigrid would have waited 20 years to claim you if she'd known where you were? Do you think the Bloodaxe Alliance would have negotiated if they weren't afraid of what the Raven's children might do to anyone who harmed you?" The truth hit Astrid like a physical blow. Magnus hadn't been working to destroy her. He'd been orchestrating an elaborate game of mutual assured destruction, keeping her enemies balanced against each other, while he positioned himself as the only person who could deliver what everyone wanted. "But it's falling apart now," she said, understanding flooding through her. "Too many players, too many variables. You can't control it anymore. Which is why I have to end it." Magnus reached into his robes and pulled out something that made every warrior in the hall tense, a small vial filled with liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Poison, from the death-cap mushrooms that grow in the sacred grove. One drop in your wine, and you'll simply fall asleep and never wake up. Peaceful, painless, and it will look like your powers overwhelmed your mortal form. And then what? Ulf had begun moving toward Magnus, but the old man was too far away and too well-positioned near the hall's main entrance. "Then I mourn the tragic loss of our beloved healer, and I negotiate with both armies as the sole authority in Ironwood. Sigrid gets to bury her niece with honor, Ragnar gets assurance that no Blackrock heir will threaten his plans, and this village survives another generation. Except for one problem," Astrid said, and her voice carried a resonance that made the very stones of the hall vibrate in sympathy. "I'm not the frightened girl you've been manipulating all these years." The healing stones in her hand erupted with light so brilliant that several villagers cried out and shielded their eyes. But Astrid was no longer entirely herself. Her mother's spirit flowed through her, along with the memories and powers of generations of Blackrock women who had refused to be victims of other people's ambitions. Magnus stumbled backward, his poison vial falling from nerveless fingers to shatter on the stone floor. "Impossible. You're untrained, undisciplined. Without proper guidance, I have guidance." Astrid's form seemed to shimmer and expand, her shadow stretching across the hall like wings. Every woman who wore this pendant before me, every vulva who blessed these stones, every Blackrock daughter who died protecting her people. They're all here. Magnus, they're all angry. The temperature in the hall plummeted as supernatural forces gathered around Astrid like a storm made manifest. Frost began forming on the wooden walls, and the very air grew thick with the presence of spirits who had been waiting decades for justice. "You want to end this?" Astrid asked, advancing on Magnus as he cowered against the sea. "Door. Then let's end it properly. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more innocent people dying for your schemes." But before she could reach him, the doors burst open and armed figures poured into the hall, not villagers, but warriors wearing the colors of the Bloodaxe Alliance. Magnus had prepared for this moment, positioning loyal fighters to intervene if his final gambit failed. "Take her alive," Magnus commanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "The contracts are already signed. She belongs to Ragnar now." The battle erupted in the confined space of the Great Hall, but it was unlike any conflict the Northern lands had ever seen. Astrid fought not just with the strength of her own arms, but with the accumulated power of her bloodline, striking down enemies with blasts of force that left their weapons melted and their armor cracked. Eric fought beside her with the fury of a man defending everything he held dear, while Ulf waded through their attackers like a force of nature, Widowmaker singing its deadly song after 20 years of silence. But the real shock came when the northern doors exploded inward and a new force entered the fray. Sigrid and her raven's children, arriving just as Magnus had planned, but not as he had expected. The vulva was a figure out of nightmares, her hair white as bone and her eyes burning with fires that had consumed her sanity long ago. She took one look at the scene, her niece surrounded by enemies, Magnus cowering in the corner, and began to weave magic that made Astrid's power look like a candle flame beside a wildfire. The Great Hall became a battlefield where politics, family loyalty, and supernatural forces collided with devastating effect. And at the center of it all stood Astrid, finally understanding that her choice was not between competing factions, but between the kind of leader she wanted to become and the kind of legacy she wanted to leave. The Great Hall fell silent as quickly as it had erupted into violence, the supernatural forces unleashed by 3 generations of Blackrock women, creating a pocket of stillness that seemed to exist outside normal time. Bodies lay scattered across the stone floor, some dead, others merely unconscious, while the survivors stood frozen in tableau, weapons half raised, caught between awe and terror at what they had witnessed. Sigrid stepped through the shattered doorway like a figure from ancient legends, her presence so overwhelming that even hardened warriors took involuntary steps backward. 23 years of exile in the northern wastes had transformed her from the wise vulva of Astrid's visions into something that existed at the intersection of human and divine. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire worlds of pain and rage, and the very air around her shimmered with power that made reality bend and flex. "My sister's daughter," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated in everyone's bones. At last, Astrid found herself caught between 2 opposing forces, the protective fury of her father, who had moved to stand between her and this terrifying figure from family legend, and the pull of blood calling to blood. The healing stones in her hand grew almost too hot to hold, responding to the presence of someone who had helped bless them decades ago. "Aunt Sigrid." The words felt strange on her tongue, addressing a woman who had been a ghost story until this moment. "You came. I have been coming for 23 years, child. Every day since I felt your mother's death through the spirit bonds that connected us." Sigrid's gaze moved to Magnus, who cowered against the wall like a rabbit caught in a wolf's stare. "Every day since this worm betrayed the location of her birthing chamber to those who would see our bloodline ended." Magnus tried to speak, but no sound emerged from his throat. Astrid realized with growing unease that her aunt's power extended far beyond healing or nature magic. This was the kind of vulva magic that could rewrite reality itself. The dangerous art that had been forbidden even in the old days. The Blackrock clan fell because we were weak, Sigrid continued, her attention returning to Astrid. We trusted where we should have been vigilant, showed mercy where we should have shown strength. Your mother believed that love could bridge the gaps between enemies, that peace could be built through understanding rather than conquest. She wasn't wrong, Astrid said, though her voice carried less conviction than she would have liked. Sigrid's laugh was like winter wind through bare branches. Look around you, niece. Look at what her beliefs cost us. A scattered clan, a murdered bloodline, enemies who grow fat on lands that belong to our people for 1,000 years. Through the broken doors, the sounds of approaching armies could be heard. Ragnar's alliance had regrouped and was advancing on the village, while in the distance, the war horns of other clans announced that word of the Blackrock heir's discovery had spread faster than wildfire. Ironwood was about to become the center of a conflict that would reshape the northern territories. "What do you want from me?" Astrid asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I want you to take your rightful place as queen of the northern clans," Sigrid replied. "I want you to restore our family's honor and reclaim the lands that were stolen from us. I want you to make our enemies pay for what they took." Ulf stepped forward, Widowmaker still gleaming with the blood of recent combat. "She's not a weapon for your vengeance, Sigrid. She's my daughter, and she gets to choose her own path." "Your daughter?" Sigrid's eyes blazed with supernatural fire. "You are nothing but the man who seduced my sister into abandoning her duties. You kept this child from her heritage, raised her in ignorance of her true nature, allowed her to waste her gifts on healing scratches and tending livestock. I kept her alive," Ulf said simply, "which is more than you managed for the rest of your family." The temperature in the hall dropped so quickly that frost began forming on every surface. Eric grabbed Astrid's arm, his touch warm and grounding in the midst of supernatural cold, while the surviving villagers huddled together for warmth and protection. But before Sigrid could respond to Ulf's challenge, a new voice cut through the tension, calm, authoritative, and completely unexpected. "Enough." All eyes turned to the speaker, and Astrid felt the world shift around her once again. Standing in the doorway was a man she didn't recognize, but somehow knew, tall and broad-shouldered like her father, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but bearing the raven banner of the Blackrock clan and wearing armor that bore the symbols of royal authority. "Uncle Thormund," Sigrid breathed, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked uncertain. Thormund Blackrock, the brother who had disowned Freya for her forbidden marriage, stepped into the hall with measured steps. Behind him came a small force of warriors who wore the ancient colors of their clan, but moved with the discipline of men who had spent years learning patience and strategy rather than simply relying on supernatural power. "Sister," he said to Sigrid, his voice heavy with old grief and older regrets, "you have let your pain consume your wisdom." "Don't lecture me about pain," Sigrid snarled. "You weren't there when they died. You didn't feel their deaths through the spirit bonds. You didn't spend 20 years gathering survivors and building strength for this moment." "No," Thormund agreed sadly. "I spent 20 years learning the difference between justice and vengeance, between strength and cruelty. I spent 20 years discovering that our sister was right about the power of choosing unity over division." He turned to Astrid, and she saw in his face an echo of her mother's features, the same strong cheekbones, the same intelligent eyes, the same expression of someone who weighed their words carefully before speaking. "Niece," he said, and the simple word carried more acceptance and recognition than all of Sigrid's grand pronouncements. "I failed your mother when she needed me most. I won't make that mistake with you." "What are you offering?" Astrid asked, though her heart was already reaching toward this unexpected family member who seemed to represent a middle path between her father's protective isolation and her aunt's destructive vengeance. "A choice," Thormund replied. "You can follow Sigrid's path of conquest and revenge, reclaiming our ancestral lands through fire and blood." You can accept Ragnar's offer of marriage and political alliance, becoming a symbol rather than a leader. Or you can forge a new path entirely, one that honors your mother's vision while acknowledging the realities of power in these northern lands. From somewhere in his armor, he produced an object that made everyone in the hall gasp, a sword, unlike any weapon Astrid had ever seen. The blade seemed to be forged from starlight itself, silver bright, but somehow containing depths of color that shifted with the viewer's perspective. The crossguard was shaped like spreading wings, and the pommel bore the combined symbols of every major clan in the northern territories. "The Unity Blade," Thormund said, offering it to her hilt first. "Forged by the dwarf smiths for the first Blackrock king, blessed by the vulva of the sacred grove, and destined to be wielded only by one who carries the blood of all the northern clans." "All the clans?" Astrid asked, her hand moving slowly toward the offered weapon. "Your mother was not the only one to marry across clan lines," Thormund explained. "For generations, the Blackrock royal family has been forming alliances through marriage, trade, and diplomacy. Iron, wolf blood flows in your veins, as does Stoneheart, and even Bloodaxe. You are not just the heir to one clan, Astrid, you are the bridge between all of them." The moment her fingers closed around the Unity Blade's hilt, the world exploded into sensation and understanding. She could feel the presence of every person with northern clan blood within 100 miles, their hopes, their fears, their desperate desire for leadership that would bring peace rather than perpetual conflict. The sword was not just a weapon but a conduit, connecting her to the spiritual essence of the land itself. Outside, the sounds of approaching armies grew louder, but they no longer seemed like harbingers of destruction. Instead, they represented opportunity, the chance to prove that strength could serve justice, that power could create rather than destroy. That a young woman who had learned healing before she learned warfare might be exactly what the northern clans needed. "The choice is yours," Thormund said quietly. "But choose quickly. The sun is rising, and with it comes the moment when words must become actions and ideals must face the test of reality." The Unity Blade sang in Astrid's hands as she stepped from the great hall into the pale morning light, its starlight steel reflecting the aurora that still danced across the dawn sky. Behind her came the survivors of the night's revelations, Ulf with Widowmaker gleaming at his side, Eric with his sword drawn and ready, Thormund flanked by his loyal Blackrock warriors, and Sigrid, whose power crackled around her like barely contained lightning. The village of Ironwood had been transformed into a battlefield while they struggled with family secrets and ancient betrayals. Ragnar's alliance forces had landed and taken positions around the settlement's perimeter, their shields forming an iron wall that glinted in the growing light. But they were no longer alone. Arriving from the north came more ships bearing the banners of clans that had been enemies for generations, all drawn by word that the Blackrock heir had finally emerged from hiding. "So many," Eric breathed, his young face pale as he took in the scope of forces arrayed against them. "Not against us," Astrid said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "They're here because they want something: leadership, legitimacy, a way forward that doesn't involve endless cycles of raid and revenge. The question is whether I can give them what they need." Magnus cowered behind them, his elaborate schemes reduced to ash by the morning's revelations. The village elder, who had manipulated events for decades now, looked like what he truly was, a frightened old man whose web of lies had finally collapsed around him. Ragnar himself strode forward under a banner of parley, his massive frame encased in armor that bore the scars of countless battles. Behind him came representatives of the other major houses, Ironheart, Stonehammer, Wolf's Head, all watching Astrid with expressions that mixed hunger and wariness. "Lady Astrid," Ragnar called out, his voice carrying easily across the space between armies. "I see you've gathered quite a family reunion. But the morning is advancing, and my allies grow impatient for resolution. Then let's resolve it. Astrid replied, raising the unity blade so its starlight steel caught and reflected the aurora overhead. But not through marriage contracts or political maneuvering. Let's settle this the old way. A murmur ran through the assembled forces as the implications of her challenge became clear. Single combat had been the traditional method of resolving disputes between clan leaders for centuries, though it had fallen out of favor as alliances became more complex and stakes grew higher. "You would face me blade to blade?" Ragnar asked, and something that might have been respect flickered in his ice-blue eyes. "You're untested in war, girl. I've been killing men since before you could walk. And I've been healing them since I could hold a herb poultice," Astrid replied. "We'll see which approach serves better when steel meets steel." But before Ragnar could respond, the air around Astrid began to shimmer with otherworldly light. The healing stones in her free hand blazed with power drawn from generations of Blackrock women, and suddenly she was no longer alone. Translucent figures materialized around her, her mother Freya, radiant with love and determination, her grandmother and great-grandmother, stern-faced queens who had ruled through wisdom rather than conquest, and behind them, a host of Blackrock women stretching back to the clan's founding. "By Thor's hammer," someone whispered from the enemy ranks, "she commands the dead, not commands," Astrid said, her voice carrying new harmonics as her ancestors' power flowed through her. "I am them, and they are me. Every lesson learned, every battle fought, every choice made in service of something greater than personal ambition." The spirit shield that formed around her was unlike anything the northern clans had ever witnessed. It wasn't the crude necromancy of hedge witches or the dark sorcery of desperate vulva. This was the pure essence of righteous power, the kind of magic that responded only to those who genuinely sought to protect rather than dominate. Freya's spirit stepped forward, her ghostly form solidifying until she appeared almost alive in the morning light. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of a queen addressing her subjects. "My daughter offers you a choice," Freya announced to the assembled armies. "Follow her willingly, and she will lead you into an age of prosperity and peace. Fight her, and face the combined might of every Blackrock queen who ever lived." The effect on the gathered forces was immediate and dramatic. Some warriors threw down their weapons and knelt, recognizing divine authority when they saw it. Others backed away in fear, unable to comprehend a power that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. But Ragnar and his core supporters held their ground, their faces set with the determination of men who had come too far to turn back. "Impressive theater," Ragnar said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "But spirits can't hold territory or negotiate trade agreements. In the end, it comes down to who has the strength to take what they want and keep it." "Then let's find out," Astrid said, and stepped forward to meet her destiny. The duel began at the moment when dawn fully broke over the fjord, transforming the water into liquid gold and casting long shadows across the makeshift arena that had formed between the opposing forces. Ragnar moved with the confidence of a warrior who had never lost single combat, his massive war axe cutting through the air in patterns that spoke of decades of experience and countless victories. But Astrid moved like something beyond mortal understanding. The unity blade seemed to guide her steps as much as she guided it, the ancient weapon flowing through defensive patterns that turned aside Ragnar's crushing blows with elegant precision. Around her, the spirits of her ancestors provided more than just protection, they whispered, tactical advice, shared memories of battles fought and won, and lent their combined skill to her inexperienced hands. "You fight like a coward," Ragnar snarled, as his axe met empty air for the third time, Astrid having flowed away from his strike like water around stone. "Stand and face me properly." "I am facing you," Astrid replied, her voice calm despite the violence of their exchange. "I'm just not fighting the way you expect." The heart of the fjord, the mystical stone that formed the spiritual center of the northern territories, began to respond to their conflict. Hidden beneath the waters for countless generations, it now pulsed with light that could be seen even through the depths. Recognizing that Something momentous was taking place above. The very land seemed to hold its breath as two different philosophies of leadership clashed in mortal combat. Ragnar's next attack was a devastating overhead blow that would have split a normal opponent from crown to groin, but Astrid didn't try to block or dodge. Instead, she stepped forward into the strike, the unity blade rising to meet his axe in a shower of sparks that lit the morning air like falling stars. For a moment, the two weapons were locked together, straining against each other with forces that went far beyond mere physical strength. "You cannot win," Ragnar growled, his face inches from hers as they struggled for dominance. "I have the strength of giants, the favor of the war gods, the support of the most powerful clans in the north. And I have something you'll never understand," Astrid replied, her eyes blazing with the accumulated wisdom of generations. "I have love." The heart of the fjord erupted with light so brilliant that it momentarily blinded everyone on the battlefield. When vision returned, Ragnar was stumbling backward, his axe falling from nerveless fingers as he stared at Astrid in shock and growing fear. The unity blade in her hands had changed, its starlight steel now shot through with veins of pure gold that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "The land itself recognizes you," Thormund said in wonder, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "The heart of the fjord responds only to a true leader, one who seeks to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm." Astrid advanced on Ragnar, but her approach was that of a healer approaching a patient rather than a warrior closing for the kill. "You're not evil, Ragnar," she said, her voice gentle despite the power that surrounded her. "You're afraid that the old ways are dying, that strength alone isn't enough anymore, that there might not be a place for warriors like you in the world that's coming." "I am not afraid," Ragnar protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You should be," Astrid continued, now close enough to touch him if she chose. "Because the world is changing. The age of taking what you want by force is ending, and the age of earning what you need through service is beginning." She could have killed him then. The unity blade thirsted for completion of the duel, and everyone watching expected her to deliver the finishing blow that would cement her authority. Instead, she did something that no one anticipated. She knelt beside Ragnar and placed her hand on his shoulder, channeling healing power into his exhausted frame. "I offer you a different choice," she said. "Serve me willingly. Help me build something better than endless war, and I'll give you a purpose greater than conquest." The effect was immediate and transformative. Ragnar's fear melted away, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like hope. Around the battlefield, warriors who had come prepared for slaughter found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. A leader who chose mercy over vengeance, who offered redemption rather than demanding submission. "I yield," Ragnar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I yield to Astrid Blackrock, rightful queen of the northern clans." One by one, the assembled armies began laying down their weapons and kneeling in recognition of the new order that had just been born. Even Sigrid, her face streaked with tears, bowed her head in acknowledgement that her niece had chosen a path their family had never dared to walk. Magnus, forgotten in the drama of the duel, tried to slip away unnoticed. But the unity blade turned in Astrid's hand like a compass needle, pointing directly at the man whose betrayals had shaped so much of their story. Justice, it seemed, still required completion. 3 months after the dawn that changed everything, Astrid stood once again by the great hearth in what had been her father's longhouse, but was now the seat of the Northern Alliance. The building had been expanded to accommodate the steady stream of visitors, clan representatives, trade delegations, former enemies seeking to understand the new order that had emerged from the ashes of the old conflicts. Magnus sat in the corner where he spent most of his days now, no longer the manipulative power broker, but simply an old man tending the fire and sweeping the floors. Astrid had chosen exile over execution, banishing him to a life of service rather than ending his life entirely. Some called it weakness, but she understood it as something her mother would have recognized the strength to break cycles rather than perpetuate them. "You're brooding again," Eric observed, settling beside her with the easy familiarity of a man who had earned his place through loyalty rather than birth. He wore the simple clothes of a village warrior still, though he now commanded the combined military forces of a dozen clans. "The delegation from the southern territories should arrive within the hour." "I know." Astrid fingered the new banner that hung from the rafters, not the raven of the Blackrock clan alone, but a design that incorporated symbols from every house that had sworn allegiance to her vision. Sometimes I wonder if Mother could have imagined this. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The northern clans, which had spent generations raiding each other's territories and feuding over ancient grievances, were now working together on projects that benefited everyone. Trade routes that had been too dangerous to travel were now protected by joint patrols. Harbors that had been fortified against invasion were being expanded to welcome merchants from distant lands. Children who would have grown up preparing for war were instead learning letters and numbers and the healing arts. Ulf entered, carrying reports from the latest council meeting, his massive frame somehow less intimidating now that he served as advisor, rather than protector. Age and contentment had softened his edges, though the legendary Widowmaker still hung at his side, not as a weapon of last resort, but as a reminder of what they had all chosen to leave behind. "The Stoneheart clan has agreed to share their mining techniques with the Iron Wolves," he reported, settling into his chair with a grunt of satisfaction. "And Ragnar sends word that the joint fishing fleet brought in the largest catch in living memory." "How is he adapting to his new role?" Astrid asked. The former enemy who had once sought to claim her as a political prize now served as her primary lieutenant, his warrior's skills redirected toward protecting trade routes and negotiating disputes between allied clans. "Better than anyone expected," Ulf replied, with something that might have been amusement. "Turns out he's quite good at organizing people once you give him something worthwhile to organize them for." Through the open windows came the sounds of construction, new buildings rising to house the growing population, expanded workshops where craftsmen from different clans shared techniques that had been jealously guarded secrets for generations, and the laughter of children playing games that mixed traditions from across the northern territories. Thormund appeared in the doorway, his travel-stained clothes marking him as recently returned from another diplomatic mission. "The Western clans have agreed to the Mutual Defense Pact," he announced, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "That makes 17 allied houses, covering territory from the Whale Road to the Ice Mountains." "And Aunt Sigrid?" Astrid asked, though she could already sense the answer through the mystical connections that bound their family together. "Still rebuilding the sacred grove, still training young Volva in the proper use of their gifts." Thormund's expression grew thoughtful. "She sends word that the spirits of our ancestors are finally at peace, knowing that their sacrifices led to something worthy." As the afternoon wore on, the longhouse filled with the usual collection of petitioners, advisors, and allies who made up Astrid's daily routine. A dispute between fishing crews required mediation. Trade agreements needed reviewing. Messages from distant lands sought answers to questions of diplomacy and alliance. But as evening approached and the visitors departed, Astrid found herself once again by the fire with the people who mattered most. Ulf, whose love had shaped her childhood. Eric, whose loyalty had helped define her character. And even Magnus, whose betrayals had ultimately taught her the difference between manipulation and leadership. "Do you ever regret it?" Eric asked quietly, echoing a question that had haunted their private conversations since the transformation began. "The quiet life you gave up, the simple healing practice you could have maintained?" Astrid considered the question seriously, as she always did. Outside, the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, the same lights that had illuminated her childhood, but now seemed to dance in celebration of something larger than any one person's happiness. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember that the quiet life was built on lies, and the simple healing practice was limited to scratches and minor ailments. Now she gestured toward the reports scattered across the table, each one documenting another small miracle of cooperation and growth. Now I'm healing something much larger. Ulf reached over and squeezed her shoulder with the gentle strength that had comforted her since infancy. "Your mother would be proud," he said simply. "Not of the crown you wear or the power you wield, but of the choices you've made about how to use them." As the fire burned low and the household settled into sleep, Astrid remained by the hearth for a few minutes longer, reflecting on the path that had brought her from simple village healer to Queen of the Northern Alliance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that leadership could be about building rather than conquering, that strength could serve justice rather than ambition. But tonight, she was simply grateful for the family that had shaped her, for the love that had sustained her, and for the chance to transform a legacy of blood and betrayal into something worthy of the woman whose pendant she still wore close to her heart.